Welcome to Podcasting Power Hour with your host, Jeff Townsend, aka the Indie Podcast Father. I'm your co-host, Greg, from Indie Drop-In Network. Podcasting Power Hour is recorded live every Monday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Twitter Spaces. Every week, an experienced panel of podcasters and other experts will tackle your podcasting questions. We will, of course, put links to all of our guests and any relevant information in the show notes. All right, let's get this party started.
Welcome to Podcasting Power Hour. It's the 17th of October. Holy shit, time's flying, man. Each Monday's better than the next. Greg, man, tonight's a big one, right?
Yeah, we've disproven that time flies when you're having fun. It also flies when you're not.
And just to be completely honest, we are going to really, I don't know, if you have anything you want to talk about podcasting-wise, please come up here and speak, because we don't necessarily have a huge topic this week, but more or less would like to have at least one time of the month where we're, a little bit more open discussion and then try to structure things. So with that being said, I'm Jeff Townsend. My co-host is Greg. He only has one name. He's like Prince. He's like, well, I guess Gandhi had more than one, but all you need to know is he's Greg.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Podcasting Power Hour. I'm Greg. I created Indie Drop-In Network, so if you want to check that out, you can click the profile. I'm just going to get all my plugs in now because I suspect people are going to be dropping off like crazy.
Well, and that's all his plugs. All right. Jim Mallard, he has a controversial yet controversial podcast about anything the last decade. Jim, what's going on?
Conversational yet controversial.
Same thing.
Not quite, but
Little known fact.
What's going on? Not a lot.
Yeah, little known fact about Jim, Jeff. I can squeeze this in. He coined the phrase, just duck it.
Yeah, I'm the one that convinced Apple to change, the duck.
Yeah. Neil Hedley. I have a feeling you're going to be put on the spot today. So thank you for joining us, man.
I have that sense too, but that's okay. I had it coming. Rapidly inheriting the throne as the grumpy old man of podcasting. Although this is my absolute favorite time of year. You get into the middle of October, and Walgreens has started taking down the Christmas decorations to make room for the Valentine's Day stuff. It's heartwarming. It really is.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
Plug in the sound. Okay, we'll go ahead and get going. Did everybody see it's no secret, I don't think, at this point in time, just to kick things off here, the news that TikTok is preparing to launch an actual podcast app? You see this, Greg?
Well, yeah, it's, I guess it's speculation. I heard it on Pod News. Was it today or this morning? And I guess they're seeing the TikTok user agent crawling feeds, which I thought it was pretty interesting, the sleuthing that they do, because they actually kind of follow it back to the BGP ASIN number, which is the network number that I guess the TikTok servers are using, which, I guess that's reporting work.
Are they saying they're A-casting me? Are they A-casting me, Greg?
No, I think they're probably just they're probably just collecting data. Who knows to do what with? Maybe they could just be collecting data for all you know. Maybe they're not going to do anything with it.
Why is it significant? Well, just reading the article, which we've already plugged for Pod News, over 1 billion monthly users and over 138 million active U.S. users. So that's pretty big. And recently they registered a trademark for TikTok Music. I assume that's how it would tie in. Obviously, none of that's officially known yet, but that's my guess.
I think that makes a lot of sense because they already have music contracts, right? They already know all the people. They already pay royalties to labels and musicians, So, if you know the people and you know the math, the business math,
and they have a channel on Sirius XM that plays the same 7 songs.
There you go. Is that internet radio, Jim? I'm just not familiar with these alternate channels.
Satellite radio that really never went anywhere.
I know, man. I'm just messing with you.
Well, I just had to drab that one out there too. And is this gonna be like Facebook and podcasts? Like didn't they get in it and then get back out of it before the
That was
getting in it?
That was so fast.
1 year.
Yeah. Facebook is so weird because, pages don't do anything either. So why you would connect, podcasting to pages just doesn't make any sense to me. Like,
well, pages used to do stuff and then they realized they could make money and then it was all over.
Yeah. I really love Facebook groups, but Facebook for anything else just doesn't. I like Facebook ads less so than I did, years ago. But I like Facebook groups though. I think groups are still pretty effective.
Yeah, my grandma loves them too, Greg. But
I know. That's how I know her.
Yep, exactly. So no, I'm not surprised, and I guess I don't have a whole lot to say on that. I'm curious, I guess, to see what happens with it. I don't know if it's going to be kind of like an Amazon Music. That's what where you have the music and that there. I don't know, just an assumption.
Yeah, Amazon Music's doing a big push into podcasting. So I know a few podcasters that have deals cooking with them, me included. So we're gonna do some cool stuff.
You are cool, Greg. You are cool. So, Greg, we talked about earlier putting. Well, he doesn't know it, but we just had a conversation. I don't know, half an hour ago, putting Neil on the spot. Just kick things off here. Yeah,
what I like to do is, kind of a plan that I had that I cultivated last week with Jeff is to try to highlight some of our, reoccurring speakers, our panelists. So last week, we had Fuzz come in and talk about PR. So, like how Neil prefers, I thought I would tell him nothing about this, send him no questions whatsoever, and just put him on the spot.
Here I am, ready to be spotted.
See, the problem is you're a professional. That's the issue. You can't stump the professional. But no, Neil, on Twitter, you had a great question, actually. And, I poked a little fun at it because that's just what we do on Twitter. Mm-hmm. But a
lot of poking, yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of poking. But so give us your recommendations on how to properly set up a guest in your opinion, and then we'll kind of collect everyone else's thoughts.
The truthful answer to that is going to sound weaselly because there is no best way that works for every guest. It's going to depend on the level of expertise of your guest. If, for example, if you are, and I think the exchange that you're talking about from Twitter earlier was when I repeated a claim I've made about 5,000 times before, which is it's probably not the best idea to have your second question ready to go until you've heard the answer to the first question when you're doing a guest interview. And that comes from 40 years of radio and television, probably somewhere between 15 and 20,000 interviews. And just my experience in streamlining the things that I know now versus in 1981 when I first started and did my first interview. So, for example, if you're interviewing the President of the United States, well, you're not going to get that interview unless they get an advanced list of questions. And some bumpers are set up along the way that's, here's how far you can veer off in this direction, and here's how far you can veer off in that direction. And you can take gambles if you want to once the cameras are rolling, because I guarantee you George Stephanopoulos did not tell Joe Biden in advance that he was going to ask if Vladimir Putin is a killer. I guarantee you that blindsided the White House. They did not see that coming. But most of those super high profile guests like that, you're probably going to need to give them a roadmap for where it's going so that they are ready for the gotchas that might come creeping in. But if you're doing an interview with, Bob that does the Star Wars podcast, and please don't get me wrong, I wish I had a Star Wars podcast at this point. I don't know that Bob needs your advanced list of questions. In fact, my favorite interviews are the ones where it's just the thing I always taught my broadcasting students was an interview is just a conversation that is so compelling you can't help but eavesdrop on it. And think of the number of times you've walked into a cocktail party. Remember when we used to have cocktail parties and there would be those ridiculously compelling conversations happening all over the room? Well, nobody had a pre-selected list of questions for those conversations. They were just genuine people who were genuinely interested in what each other had to say. And there was a genuine give and take there. I've seen so many scenarios, especially where people are interviewing, for example, rock bands, where they'll say, so tell me about and again, this is in the hands of an amateur interviewer. They'll have their list of questions, and question one will be, tell me about the recording sessions for this latest album. And the lead singer will say, well, we decided early on in the production that we were going to record the entire album in the nude, and that's what we did. And it goes back to the interviewer who says, okay, that's great. Tell me about your musical influences. I'm like, wait, whoa. If you stick to your list of questions, it's a recipe for disaster at that point, because you're going to at some point get welded to the list and you're going to forget to just actually have a conversation. I will throw in this one quick last story as an example of exactly what I'm talking about, and then I'll get out of the way and let somebody else talk about it. I don't know, it was about 5 years ago. I had an interview with Bryan Adams, the singer, and Brian with a B. And we were doing it, simulcasting it on radio and on live television at the same time. So Brian comes in, and I didn't know this at the time, but Brian was having a rough morning. And so Brian came in, and he was there to promote his brand new album called The Tracks of My Years, which is the music that Brian was listening to when he was a kid and deciding that he wanted to become a rock star. These were the songs that really grabbed him and made him want to be a singer. Brian's having a rough day. So I'm sitting there on live television with him, and I'm trying to talk to him about the new record. And he's literally sitting with his arms folded across his chest, leaned back in the chair like he had smelled a bad fart, and really wasn't into the conversation. And in my head, I'm going through the list of questions that the producers had put into the teleprompter, because it was television. And really quickly, I'm looking at the list and I'm going, okay, this is not working. He's not into talking about this album today, because this is probably his 150th interview about this record, and he's tired of talking about it. So we took a commercial break. We come back from the commercial, and I start asking him about the picture that's on the album cover. Who took the picture? And suddenly, out of the blue, because I had done my prep and knew everything there was to know about Bryan Adams, I could go back and I could go, okay, Bryan Adams also loves talking about his career as a photographer. So if he doesn't want to talk about the record, let's talk about photography. And I start asking him a million unprepared questions about photography. Suddenly, it's a whole different Bryan Adams. Suddenly his arms unfold. He's leaning across. He's leaning over toward me with his hands, his elbows resting on his knees. And he's suddenly re-engaged, because it's not something he's exhausted and tired of talking about. But if I had just stuck to my list of questions and had depended on my list of questions to be the basis for the interview, I wouldn't have gone down the whole photography road. The thing where I got lucky was my version of interview prep is, if you've got a guest sitting there, learn everything you can possibly learn that there is to know about them without having gone through their recycling bin. And know everything just off the top of your head, so you can pull those things out and then have a rough idea where you want to go, but have done enough prep that you can pivot 16 different ways if it starts to go sideways. That's all I got.
No, Neil, I love that, because a lot of times people will spend a lot of the prep work actually prepping out questions. And that's not my style at all. I spend my time, like you said, researching on the individual, then I kind of let the conversation take place. Like, I have a roadmap of where I want it to go. Obviously, I'm able to keep it on track, but I feel like it's better to prepare my time actually researching that part of it more than I'm gonna script out every single question I'm gonna ask this person. And the reason is because depending on an answer, it might segue to something else. You know what I mean? Or
Yeah,
like you said, depending on the vibe you're getting.
Yeah, that's absolutely where you can take it. And I mean, don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with coming up with a list of questions. The the art of the list of questions is in knowing when to detach yourself from it and crumple it up and throw it away and go, this is not going to work anymore for this conversation. And if you really do frame it in your head as the only thing an interview is a conversation that's worth eavesdropping on, it completely changes the dynamic of it. You know, you may need to ask some of the basic stuff that you already know, because not everybody that's listening to the interview has done the same amount of prep that you have. If I'm going to sit down with Mark Hamill on my Star Wars podcast, maybe there are people who don't know a whole ton about, you know, Mark Hamill and maybe his career before Star Wars or wherever it is you want to go with it. And so you need to bring those people to the party, because the other thing you've got to remember is that not everybody is necessarily obsessed with the subject matter, and you still got to make the conversation accessible and interesting to those people as well. I said on a thing of Dave Jackson's on the Ask the Podcast Coach one episode, he said, "What's the best interview question?" And I said, the only interview question I ever prep is the first one. I come up with a killer first question. And as long as my first question was good enough, then the rest of the interview will be just fine.
Love that. What do you think, Greg?
Yeah, I think that's 40 years of broadcasting professionalism hard at work. I mean, as you can tell from these, you know, spaces, I need a lot more help than that. Like when I do interviews, I always have to try to have my kind of my story, my plot, my, you know, the arc of the conversation just kind of mapped out. I try to send the plan over to the person who I'm interviewing just so that we both know what the plan is. And that wouldn't work for like a Mark Hamill, because he would never get the plan. Right. So it would be up to me to work with, you know, his PR person to make sure that, you know, I'm not stepping on any weird topics or anything like that. But you're right with that. Like you're talking to Brian Adams, he's just going to come in and you're going to have to do all the work. But if you're talking to another podcaster or somebody like a scientist or something like that, they are likely as nervous as you are. So I just feel like if I come together with a meeting of the minds, that we're both a little more chill. Now, you're absolutely right about the second question, though. Like, I have all my notes from all the interviews that I've done from my previous shows, and the amount of times I got to question 2, if I got to question 2, the interview wasn't going well.
See, and you can do that, though, because you're an interesting person. And so if you're an interesting person that's talking to another interesting person, then chances are that conversation is going to be worth listening to. I mean, you bring up scientists. I was, you know, before I decided to shift it over to video and I had to abandon it because the workload became onerous, I had a podcast where I was talking to scientists every week. It was a sleep podcast called The Snooze Button. And every week it was sleep researchers from all over the world, some of them who didn't even speak the greatest English. And in terms of whether or not they were nervous and needed to know what the roadmap was, I always went through exactly the same steps with every single one of those guests, because they weren't professional broadcasters. They weren't professional interview guests. And so my prep in advance with them always included a line along the lines of, listen, you worry about sounding like a sleep researcher and a person who knows a lot about sleep. You leave the worrying about sounding like a professional and sounding like an announcer and sounding like all that. You let me worry about that. You focus on sounding like you know your stuff, and then everything else will be fine. And I tell you, almost everybody I ever had that conversation with, you know, from the guitar tech of the smallest indie band to the stars of the biggest shows on Broadway, if they weren't used to doing interviews, that conversation, that part of it where you just went, no, let me worry about the sounding like a professional part. You take care of sounding like you, and I'll do the rest. For so many of them, they came to me and they went, you know what, that completely took all the pressure off of me, and I could just relax and be me. But sometimes people need to be reminded that before you start.
how much? Okay, so I'll just go around the room and ask because I know Jim interviews people really every week. So we'll let you answer the first question here. How much do you think is a reasonable amount or respectful amount of prep work to send over to the person, like an outline like we're talking about now? What is the appropriate amount? Should it be something? Should it be nothing? Is there a certain respect factor in it? We'll kick it off with you, Jim Mallard.
Yeah, you have to do some outlining. I don't like to write out the questions, so I prefer just to kind of put the talking points down and let it flow, and sometimes even those don't get brought up. But average rule of thumb is I like to put 2 hours in before talking to anybody. That way I kind of know who they are. I don't listen to old interviews they've done. I might listen to a couple clips just to kind of get their pace and pattern down if I haven't heard them before. That way you're not, because some people take that big, long, pregnant pause mid-thought, and you start to ask a question and they weren't done with their answer, and you kind of feel like you're jumping them all the time. And then some people are really short, so you need to be more ready to go. And some people will talk for 10 minutes, and you kind of just got to kind of scribble out something so you don't forget the thought you wanted to circle back to when they come back 9 minutes later and you go, I'm done now. Let me, and then you're like, I want to circle the whole way back to the beginning of that answer because you said something really interesting. So it really all depends on the guest. But the key of interviewing, in my opinion, tell me if I'm wrong, anybody out there, is actively listening to what your person's saying and not necessarily worrying about what your next question is or where you need to go. Because if you listen, it'll take care of itself.
If I can piggyback off of what Jim said, first of all, the second point you made was absolutely correct. You're going to steer off into the ditch really fast if you're not hanging on every word that they're saying, and you're instead thinking about what's my next question going to be. But one of the earlier things you said about watching or listening to old interview clips, very quick story about how that can serve you well. I don't know how many people in the room used to watch the show 24. But the last 2 seasons of 24, they gave the main character, Jack Bauer, a girlfriend. And his girlfriend was played by a woman named Annie Wershing, who the Star Trek fans will also know as the Borg Queen from the last season of Picard. Her character got killed off toward the end of the second season that she was on. And while Annie Wershing was on, because 24 was such a big deal at the time, all the media was talking about Jack Bauer's got a girlfriend, Jack Bauer's got a girlfriend, Jack Bauer's got a girlfriend. And so she was on Good Morning America, she was on the CBS morning show, she was on every television morning show, she was doing a million radio interviews. And here's the thing, everybody got the bio from Annie Wershing, and everybody seized on the fact that when she was a child, Annie Wershing used to be a competitive Irish step dancer. And so every television morning show and every radio show in North America was asking Annie Wershing about Irish step dancing. It comes time to do my show, and I'm doing a show in DC, and I pick up the phone and I said to her, the very first words out of my mouth, I said, I promise you, at no point in this conversation are the words Irish step dancing going to come out of my mouth. And she laughed and she said, well, if you can pull that off, I will be very grateful. And so we get to the end of the conversation. We hadn't talked about it. Annie Wershing jumps on Twitter and tags me and thanks me for being the first person she talked to in ages who actually bothered to do interview prep and could pull stuff out for an interview that wasn't in the stuff that her PR people sent over. And so the only way that I knew not to ask her about Irish step dancing is because in my prep, I watched all the interviews she'd been doing, and I'm watching her face and I'm going, oh my God, she's so obviously tired of this topic.
Yeah, they almost go into robot mode if you're not careful as well. Jim, go ahead.
Now, I'd like to follow up with the other end of that story. Now, I kind of stepped in it one time, kind of intentionally though. In that same vein, I had the late, great Jim Marsland, investigative journalist, the author of Crossfire about John F. Kennedy, all that fun stuff. And I started the show. Now, this is not where you want to start the show with him. We became fast friends after this. It kind of made us both laugh. I asked him, what's the one question you're tired of being asked? And he mentioned the Crossfire book and the conspiracy about Kennedy. And I said, well, I guess I'm throwing this first sheet of notes out because that was what I was going to ask you. And we kind of both chuckled and moved on. And we, like I said, became fast friends after that because I kind of knew that I didn't want to talk about it either, but I just played it off. But it was awkward. It made for some fun though. So you got to be ready to bounce, though. If you weren't,
What was it you
I had
stepped
some
in,
lawyers
Jim?
once. Don't ask a question you're not prepared to answer for the answer for. So keep that in mind too.
You cut out there, but I heard the end. I love that quote. And I asked you, Jim, what is it you stepped in?
You want me to say shit, Jeff? You want me to say shit? Fucking shit? What do you want me to say? How much work you want me to make for Greg?
Jeez.
Bullshit?
Well done.
Horse shit?
Come on, man.
Thank you.
Tone
Jim.
it down.
Gosh, PG-13.
You know, Jeff, there was I had a segment on my first show, Fan Dummies, where I would have people on to talk about their hobbies, and they would be able to plug whatever it was that they were, you know, like if it was authors or actors or whatever, like, you know, maybe they wouldn't even be in like a Star Trek show, but they were a Trekkie, right? So I'd have them on. Let's say a good example of this is J.N. Chaney. You know, he's written about 100 science fiction books, pretty big name. And he's a super big fan of anime. And I wanted to get him on the show. So I started doing some show prep just so I could pitch him properly. And I said, hey, we're going to do a show on My Hero Academia. I see that you have a bunch of My Hero stuff on your desk, and, you know, you want to come on the show and talk about it. And then, you know, you can plug whatever it is you want to plug. And it was one of our best shows. And we did about 10 of those episodes, and they were a fan favorite, but it's so hard to prep and find those people that, you know, we just couldn't do a lot of them. But I thought it was a really interesting concept that I haven't really heard from anyone else. I'm sure people do it, but I haven't run across it.
Yeah, that is okay. Yeah, no, that's never. I can understand why they'd say that. I don't think I've come across that either. But Greg, what about with this latest round when you're talking to? Then I'll get to Ed from The Greatest Song Ever Sung Poorly. Then we'll get to Matt from Jack Ingram. What style do you use? You have to change it up depending on who you're talking to, right? Like podcasters. I don't necessarily talk to them or ask them or interview them the same way I'm doing it with the Indiana stories with local people and communities and stuff like that. I mean, I think it's different for me. I don't go in every scenario with the same approach.
Yeah. See, unlike what Jim was saying, I do try to listen to other interviews, because really what I'm trying to figure out is if people are like overly formal or overly professional. You know, some people don't respond to joviality in situations that they consider professional. And this happens in all sorts of, career things. Like if you're at your in meetings, or you're traveling for work and you're at dinner parties, you know, some people are all business all the time. And some people are never business none of the time. And all of the deals get made, you know, while you're playing Top Golf or something. But, so yeah, I try to understand who it is I'm talking to and just approach it from where I think that they would be comfortable. And I try not to be overly professional. Like I try to be, more casual, and I don't know if you want to say folksy or whatever, but I want to make a friend as much as I want to get in, as much as I want to get the interview done. And I want to show my personality to the listeners, because listeners are subscribing to my show. So, but I also want people to have a decent experience. So you're absolutely right. So you'll notice if you listen to podcast creators, you know, I talked to my friend Josh, who does obscure history, much more, friendly than like Jack Resider, for instance, who is, you know, very serious about privacy and professionalism, etc.
Podcasting Power Hour is part of Indie Drop-In Network. If you are a podcaster looking to grow your listeners, check out IndieDropIn.com. Indie Drop-In is always free, and we have opportunities right now for comedy, true crime, scary, and paranormal podcasts. Just go to IndieDropIn.com to learn more.
And you kind of damn microphone do you use, Greg? Okay, no, we'll go to my good friend Ed. Then we will go to Mark with digital dissection. And I think his podcast has gone kind of pivoted a little bit, and they've done a crap ton of interviews over the last year. So we'll get to you, Mark, after Ed. Ed from Greatest Song Ever Sung Poorly. You want to chime in anything here?
Actually, no. I'm just listening today, I think.
Okay, it's perfectly fine.
This is the greatest Twitter space ever done poorly.
Exactly. He usually has something to say. I was just giving him, his moment, but we'll go ahead and give Mark his moment. Seriously, Mark, good pal, man. Good to see you. What do you got going on?
Hey, I was just listening at first and then decided I wanted to chime in because, this topic is fairly close to a lot of the things that we've kind of learned from over the last year and a half, 2 years. And the thing I've heard people kind of focusing on at different points, I agree with a lot, especially when it comes to outlining a conversation, trying to figure out things that, that you think are good kicking off point. The thing that I spend a lot of time doing to kind of mirror what Neil said, I do actually listen to other interviews as well, because we approach interviews a little bit differently, where we're trying to figure out the questions that they're not being asked, kind of like what Jim mentioned too. And I put a good amount of effort into that, trying to figure out something that someone's not used to answering. And I kind of make it a personal goal to do that. And I can't tell you how many times I've had someone say, I don't get asked that question, or that's never been asked before. If I'm not getting that response from somebody, I feel like I haven't done my job as a.
That's a great feeling, isn't it? It really is.
Yeah, dude, it's totally. It's to the point now where whenever we interview someone, we're waiting for that. Like we're expecting one of the questions that we've kind of prepped to get there. But to the point of a couple other folks that have made this, we don't necessarily get to every question that we have kind of in our lineup either. And this doesn't just start during the conversation with the person. It's part of our prep going into even asking them to be on the show. Like we're sitting there from the very beginning, mentioning to people that we're not looking to just interview you and have you, have to basically take a whole bunch of like throwing knives at the board kind of thing. So we want you to actually have a conversation, low stress environment, and that's part of the ask when we reach out. So it's not just the, when the mic is on, it's that way from the beginning. And I think it really does change just the dynamic of what, that person's expecting going in. So I wanted to say that because I can't tell you how much I've learned from this over the last year and a half. And it really takes the nerves out of the situation too. When you start realizing you are just talking to another human, and it becomes much more natural.
Yeah. And I think that's really what I go with on, like, let's say Indie Podcaster, for example, but we'll get to you next, Matt. But on the flip side of that, when I'm doing this like local podcast or like the one I'm doing now, you really have to spend quite a bit of time knowing what the hell you're talking about too. You know what I mean? Like we want to talk to about historical figures or events or places. You really have to put in the time on that stuff to make sure you're able to have the conversation.
Totally. I completely agree with you, Jeff. Like it does change the dynamic of a conversation depending on what that subject matter is. And I think in doing interviews versus doing like original content, quote unquote, the original content, I think I spend more time making sure to nail the facts, while interviews, I'm looking to nail the one thing that I hope they don't get asked about very often. And so it does almost feel like two different kinds of shows from that perspective. But yeah, I've enjoyed learning from it a lot. And I think a lot of people here have probably gone through something similar.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Matt, you've been waiting patiently. It's Matt from Jacking Around Jack Ingram podcast. How you doing, Matt?
Hey, how are y'all? Yeah, I was
good to see you again. Yeah.
Yeah, man. I would just hammer home what everybody said. My biggest compliment as a producer of two shows with country music artists was that Jack had Kat Osterman, and Kat is a Olympic softball player, won the gold medal, a bunch of silver medals. And at the end of the hour and a half interview, she said when she was leaving, she goes, "That was great, fantastic. We didn't talk about the Olympics. That's the first time ever. Well, we didn't talk about the Olympics, but for 5 minutes. So that was a big compliment. But that's what I do as a producer for Jack and this other show that's coming out in a couple of weeks. I'll research exactly what they don't talk about. And then I'll send Jack a bullet point list of here's what they don't talk about. And then we'll hammer that home. And then generally they will go, they do their prep, how they do their prep. But that's what I try to hammer home. Most importantly, I also try to, because some of these artists will start chasing rabbits and start talking in circles like I do. I'll have to put on a screen, because it's both in video. I'll have to sometimes pop up on the screen of trying to keep them on task, because they're so deep in the conversation that they don't realize they're talking about things that maybe the average listener is not going to know about. So I'll have to pop something up on a screen to kind of get them to hammer home a point so the average listener can engage with what they're visiting about. So anyways, but that y'all are totally right. It's regardless who the guest is, try to visit with what they don't usually talk about, and they'll respect you for it. That's at least in the world that I'm in. But no, that's fantastic feedback from y'all.
If I can jump in on that point, there is a fine line between trying to seize on something that they don't get asked about a lot versus trying to sound like the smartest kid in the room. There was this legendary TV interviewer in Canada who always had this knack of getting that one question in on every interview with every celebrity, where the celebrity would sit back and go, "How did you know that?" Or "How did you learn that about me?" Blah, blah, blah. But he got to this stage later in his career, toward the end of his career, where sometimes the thing that they weren't asked about very often is because they weren't terribly interested in talking about it, or they weren't interested in talking about it at all. Like if you consume enough of their back catalog of interviews that they've done or interviews that they've given to websites or whatever, you can usually stumble on one thing that you can tell hardly anybody asks, but boy, do they ever wish they could talk about it more. You get a feeling for the thing that they wish they could talk about. Like in the Annie Wershing case that I was mentioning earlier, Annie Wershing, hardly anybody knew because it wasn't in the bio that went out when she did 24. She had a background in musical theater. And so when we were talking, I asked her, which is easier, working big or working small? Meaning, when you're working big, you're on a stage and you have to make all of your facial gestures very big and very pronounced so the people in the back row of the theater can see your facial expressions. Except that when you're on TV, the camera zooms right in on you, and if your eyebrow twitches, everybody watching the show will see that. And so I asked her the differences between actors called it working big versus working small. And it took us down this whole rabbit hole of her career in musical theater and the parts that she loved to play and experiences she had in theater. Nobody else was getting that stuff because everybody was focused on the Irish step dancing thing that was in her bio. But I found some nuggets that were like, I bet she wishes she could talk about this thing over here more than she does.
Amen. You're a pro, aren't you, Neil? Gosh, boys, you nailed it. That's fantastic.
He is a pro.
But you're right, totally. And that's probably subconsciously. I'll look at hours of video as I'm traveling, finding something that these guests enjoy talking about, but they rarely talk about it. It's kind of like finding a diamond in the rough. But
and you got to find a natural way to get into those things too. Here, last thing, and I'm just going to shut up for the whole rest of the space. I promise. Bob Costas. I don't know if anybody remembers the ill-fated TV late night talk show he had called Later. Bob Costas had as one of his first guests, Jerry Seinfeld. And Bob Costas is good if he's doing sports. Bob Costas is good if he's doing Olympic coverage. But Bob Costas had Jerry Seinfeld on, and they're sitting in front of a cheesy fireplace in armchairs. And he looks over at Jerry and he says, "I understand you've got some interesting observations about the grocery store." And I shriveled up and died in my chair. It's like, It's the worst possible setup for if you're interviewing a comic. Like, is it possible to come up with a more terrible question than asking them about their observations on a subject? Come on, Bob, do better.
So before we get into the second part of that question that I asked Greg, do you want to go over this evening's sponsor? Here we're past the halfway point here.
Who's the sponsor?
There isn't one. That's the best part about it. Okay, all right.
I was like, did I get a check in the mail? Because I can't remember.
No, it's all under the table stuff I'm keeping.
Oh, well, that's good. So you better earn your keep then there, Jeff.
No, the second half of that question, nobody touched up on a whole lot here, so I want to get back to it. How much should we be giving them ahead of time? Like, what is a respectable amount, in all of your opinion? Because we touched up on like what we like to do a whole lot, but let's go back to the other end and what we think's right or wrong, if there even is such a thing there. Greg, you want to kick off that answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all said it was personal preference, but if I were to set a best practice, my advice would be to just send a little note over to the person and tell them
with emojis in it, winky faces, or I mean, what are we talking?
I mean, it depends who you're talking to, and I mean, know your audience, but with a little note saying, "Here's the things I'm hoping to get. What are you hoping to get out of this interview?" And I'll make sure to work it in. I think that I always believe that a meeting of the minds ahead of any other meeting, like a prep meeting, an email correspondence, some sort of agreement of what's going to take place, at least at a high level. I think you're going to set yourself up to succeed, even if you don't use any of that stuff. It'll at least get you started.
I like that. I like that whole way of going about it, of what you're trying to get out of it. I think I might cover a lot of that in the original conversation about coming on to the podcast in the first place. You know what I mean? Like, this is why we would do it, this and that. But I like your point of what, that person's going to get out of it, but vice versa. Go ahead, Neil. I saw you unmute.
Yeah, sorry, I did it by accident. But you hit it right on. They know why they're coming on your show. They know why you're going to interview them. At least I hope they do. And so they should probably be ready to talk about whatever that is and be ready to field whatever question it is you're going to throw at them. If like what Greg's saying makes absolute sense in terms of, the communication back and forth before the interview, in case there's anything that they want to make sure gets covered that isn't, blatantly obvious to you. Like, you find out 3/4 of the way through your interview with Mark Hamill, for example, that he's got a book coming out. Well, nobody told you about the book. And so you didn't know to ask about the book, and he made a reference to it, and that's the first time you've heard of it. If you get those conversations done in advance, it's like, is there anything you want me to make sure I find a way to work in there? Then that's great. But to me, I'll go back to the very first thing I said in the space tonight was, unless it's the president, they know why you're going to be on your show. They're probably not expecting any gotcha questions if they're just on your podcast to talk about how great, in your case, Jeff, how great things are in town or whatever your attraction is that you've come on the show to talk about. So I don't know that you necessarily need to do anything questions wise, prep wise, other than put them at ease and make sure you know what their expectations are. Because the other side of that is, if you give them a list of questions that you think you're going to get to, and you start to veer off of that list of questions, what might happen is they might have prepped answers to those questions and nothing else. And so when you veer away from the list of questions you sent them, they might have nothing to say because they didn't prep for that question.
No, that's exactly correct. I know I've interviewed authors and stuff where you can just tell, like I said earlier, it becomes robotic almost. Their answer, even the way they're saying it, everything, the delivery is just a repeat process, and you can tell that. And I think with my short time in radio, that was key, because a lot of these people that are going and doing interviews, whether it be for, let's just say something they've got going on professionally, then they have so many interviews and they get asked the same thing. So to your point earlier, you got to change it up a little bit, because some people are just so used to giving the exact same answers. Okay, Jim, you have anything to throw in on this before we kind of kick off this a little bit?
I have one more tip for people out there, especially if they're interviewing somebody on that mid-range or below, who doesn't talk a lot. We've talked about interviewing other podcasters like Amazon authors, not to discount any of these people, but they get going fast sometimes. And so what my tip is, ask them if they have any events or anything that I may have missed when I'm preparing for them, or anything they want me to know precisely. Like I said, especially events. If they're doing a book signing or going to a para conference or whatever it may be, October 17th at 9 p.m., they will not remember that when I ask them. It's good to have it handy, especially if they're promoting something very specific.
Okay. Greg, if you don't mind, I'm going to just kind of ask, I guess, another question, unless you had something you wanted to ask.
No, I have a tactical question about guests on podcasts, but you go first. I'll go second.
No, I think my question is, so once you are about, and you're in the moments leading up to this conversation, I hate interview. Actually, I go with conversation. That's just my approach. But leading up to that time when you're about to hit the record button, what are some things that you say to the people that you're talking to ease them? I know that I'll say, hey, this is going to be really chill and laid back. And there's several people in here that have talked to me before in this setting, and hey, nothing to worry about. I try to joke, kind of ease. I don't, even if there is not any tension, but just the tension of having an interview in the first place. I try to just quickly ease that before I go into the conversation. Greg, I'll let you go ahead and comment first on my kind of question. What are some things you guys do?
Yeah, see, that's really tricky, because I do that too. I have like a 10-minute pre-conversation, like icebreaker, but I find that I regret it, honestly, because some of that stuff that we talk about in the 10 minutes is my favorite stuff. And, when we're getting to know each other and, this is going to be really chill, and, hey, did you make it? How did you find the Zoom or whatever? Oh, the effing Zoom, I had to download the thing. And to the point where I've just said, hey, I'm going to hit record now, because there might be some goodness in our prep. And if it sucks, I'll cut it. Don't worry. And they're like, oh, okay, cool. And then they immediately forget we're recording and the interview's over. So I don't know. I'm torn, because it just depends on, like I said, the professionalism of who you're talking to. Some people really like the green room chit chat, and then okay, we're going on, and their personality completely changes. It goes from normal person to professional athlete or whatever. And you're just like, hey, where did, Susan go? Like, she was cool. You're like a crazy lunatic. And so I don't know. The way it's done is the icebreaker. That's the whole reason you have like the green room and the prep and the people, the producers coming in going 5 minutes, whatever. But I hit record immediately. When we get on Zoom or whatever, I'm like, hey, I'm hitting record. They're like, cool.
I tell Jack and Brad both, our goal is when the guest walks in, and I tell the guest this, when you walk in that room, there's no, because I want to get all the gripping and grinning, how are you doing on tape. So I immediately get them to sit down and start recording. And that's the goals, because you're right. You nailed it. I bet you it's so frustrating, because after the conversation, the artist will have, an hour and a half later, they'll stop, they'll go outside, and they'll shoot the shit for 45 minutes. I'm sitting there going, why in the hell? This is brilliant stuff y'all just talked about. But whatever. Point is, they walk in the room, the studio, and and I tell the guest, let's go. Say all the how you doings are going to be on camera and on tape. But the one big question I ask the guest, I always ask, and really the only question, what or what is off limits? What do you not? Jack will not talk about anything that has to do with his wife. Just off limits. They'll say, what anything off limits? And 9 times out of 10, they won't give me anything. But anyways, that's kind of how I feed them.
That's an interesting point you bring up there, Matt, with the anything you don't want to talk about, because I know I've an example would be I talked to Sarah Attorney, right? And her sister was murdered by their father. And that was like a weird one going into, right? So I asked in the beginning, like, what are you comfortable with? She immediately cut me off. She's like, everything's fine. I'm open to anything. It's like, oh, okay. But I had to ask because the respect factor was there, right? I mean, it's a terrible, tragic situation, or it may be a different kind of situation. It may not be as sad and tragic, but just as meaningful to them. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Now, I also tell the guests too, with Jack's show, I'm like, look, Jack might say something stupid and try to beat it. I edit all of this. So if at any time during the taping, Jack starts chasing a rabbit you don't want to chase, just say something and then I'll creatively edit it. Now, I've had this happen before where I've taped 2 full-blown episodes and the guests told me they didn't want me to air them. And those episodes were brilliant, fantastic. But for whatever reason, the guests didn't. They went down to some deep personal conversations. I guess they woke up a few days later and said, I don't want it to air. And so moving forward, what I did was said, look, I'll edit out a few minutes of anything you want to be edited out, but this episode's gonna come out in 2 weeks. But yeah, I've done 2 episodes that were freaking brilliant and can't do anything with them. So I kind of had to change my approach afterwards by saying I will edit out a few minutes, but the episode will be coming out on July 5th or whatever.
I just had to take one down. It's been up for 6 months.
Really?
Yeah. And they reached out to me and said, I can't have it. I can't have it out there anymore. And I'm just like, no problem.
Oh,
I mean, I have bigger fires to fight than a single podcast episode.
What was the context?
It was a true crime. It was, again, like Jeff, it was a true crime episode. And they said that there's just too much publicity and it's, like ruining their lives. And I went, hey, I'm happy to help. Delete,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. Not worth it.
Wow.
Jim, go ahead.
I was going to say, I've had a guest reach out to me and just say, can you change my name on the podcast to my pen name that I'm using now? You don't have to change any of the audio. She was applying for a job. She didn't want it coming up when her employer searched her. Done. Easy enough for me to do. So it does happen. It's weird out there sometimes. And back to Greg's point about pre-shows, I try to limit it as much as possible because I hate what, like Greg was saying. You have a great conversation. Greg brings something up to me during the pre-show, and I reference it back during the show, and nobody has a clue what we're talking about except the 2 of us. And that is the absolute worst.
Absolutely. All right, Greg, before we finish up here, I know you had a question you wanted to throw out here.
Yeah, while we have so many interview experts, I just kind of wanted to get a tactical question answered. If you're having a guest on your podcast to talk about something you are an expert in, but they are not. So like this happens a lot in podcasts about podcasting, or like superhero shows or whatever, where they'll have another podcaster on who is maybe an enthusiast for Spider-Man, but it's the Spider-Man podcast, right? How do you go about creating the right story? Because the guests are going to be less informed about the topic than the hosts. And I get invited to all sorts of podcasts, and I don't go for this very reason, because it just doesn't seem like a good show to me. So I would love people's advice on that.
I mean, I'll jump in to start with. I mean, my thing about booking guests has always been, am I going to learn something from them? And if the answer to that isn't yes, then why am I booking them in the first place? So that's an interesting scenario. I've never run into that one. I probably should seek out somewhere they would do something like that. But I can't imagine booking a guest who would come on to talk about a topic when I know more about that topic than they do, because then all it becomes is there's so many different ways that could just sound like the host showing off. And I feel like that's just a recipe for disaster. But I wish I had more on that one, but I don't.
Yeah, I think it's such a weird thing that happens in the podcast industry, because everybody says, get on other people's shows. Well, if you have me on a paranormal show, what I can talk about is other paranormal podcasts. I don't know anything about the paranormal. I just know about promoting paranormal
you
shows.
could totally fake it, Jeff. I'm looking at Jeff's little picture. Greg, you could totally fake it and fool a bunch of paranormal people into thinking that you've been out ghost hunting for years. That's beside the point. Sorry.
See, if you asked me on your show, Jim, and you just told me to just create a persona, that's a totally different thing. That's a bit totally different.
Old Greg. He wants you to create old Greg. No, we got another Matt that jumped up here. My pal Matt, he has a couple different podcasts. What's up, Matt?
Hey, Jeff. How's everybody doing tonight? I actually want to piggyback off of this conversation that we're having about, being more knowledgeable about the topic than, say, your guests. A couple weeks ago, actually maybe a month or two now, I had a situation on one of my podcasts, 69 Whiskey, where we were actually interviewing people from the other podcasts I co-host, because I thought it would be a good show to be a part of. And I thought the conversation would be great and all that stuff. And then halfway through, my co-host for Whiskey, Eric, he kind of starts going into the usual shtick of what we talk about, which is, kink, BDSM related subjects, something that my guests from Bromigos who were with us were not very fond of. And actually, I got a text halfway through in our group chat yo, this is making me super uncomfortable. And to be honest with you, that is probably one of the few instances where I felt mortified, because here I am thinking that we were going to have a casual kind of bro talk kind of conversation, maybe talk about what we do on our show, on the other show, so to speak. And my co-host kind of just completely did not read the room at all and kind of just went into the shtick that, we normally do, but it kind of bothered me that he didn't really realize that was something that they weren't too adept in knowing about. And I got a lot of feedback from my friends Mike and Dante from Bromigos after the fact and said, yo, that was really fucking uncomfortable. And I apologized profusely, because I said to them that was not how I envisioned that going at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the podcasters on other shows because they've been told that that's how you promote your show. I've been told that countless times, Greg. It's the kiss of death, because just like Neil said, everybody has to bring something to the table, right? That's the only time it works. And, if I host a Spider-Man podcast, there's not going to be a lot of people out there who are casual Spider-Man fans that are going to be able to bring something new to the table. So you have to be really creative on why those people are on the show. Maybe they're talking about their collection, or they're talking about how it impacted their life. Or, it can't be about Spider-Man. It has to be adjacent to Spider-Man or something, right? You have to pull a story out of it somehow. And that's the only way I can think to do it. And that's why I decline most of these interviews, because I'm just tell me what you want to talk about, because I don't know anything about home stereos from the 70s. Your podcast is dope, but not for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, Greg, you reminded me why I haven't done an interview in a few years. Thanks.
They're just all going in your junk mail, huh?
I seriously haven't got an interview request in probably over a year.
We've talked about it though off and on, Jim.
I know, but you don't count, Jeff. You know what I'm talking about. Straight up from some random person.
Yeah. I don't mean to speak over anybody if somebody's about to talk, but yeah, I think for me, to answer Greg's question, I try very hard to avoid that sort of awkward situation. And I'll give you an example, right? With any podcaster, my podcast there, I'll get submissions all the time for other podcasters or content creators. And I say content loosely, right? Because I'm talking people that write books or have websites. And I really have to make sure it's something that I could tie in for it to be a valuable learning experience to the people listening to my podcast. And I take that into mind in, picking out how I could center an episode around it. Or like I just said, could the audience benefit from it? So those are things I really think about ahead of time, big time.
There's also no requirement that guest be the entire focus of the entire show. If you found somebody, for example, for your Spider-Man podcast, and they have a really cool collection, there's absolutely nothing wrong with your interview guest only making up the first 4 minutes of your 45-minute show, and then the other 41 is back to something else that's interesting.
See, Neil, I knew you'd come up with something.
He's right. Absolutely right.
That's a great idea.
Yep. And that leads to, though, if that's like sometimes like Jim Mallard, for example, but his entire podcast is based on the interview. So I think that would be him going way off the rails, doing something that he never does.
Well, you could center the episode around collectors.
Yeah.
And just, record 4 or 5.
Yeah.
And talk about that.
Yeah, as I said, back in the day, I used to do that kind of approach where I'd get 4 people.
We have a live show now, Jim.
4 people in an hour. But because of all the technical ends of the back end, but I'd bring four different authors on. Hey, come on, promote that book, or give me that book, and we'll talk for a few minutes, and then you got to be going. So keep it tight. You got to be ready. But most of the time, it worked out really well.
If you think about these like small market radio stations, like they have tons of those type of shows where people just call in, ask a question, and the expert just goes after it. I mean, and before you know it, you've been listening to the thing in your garage for like 3 hours.
Or even just like the news in the morning, whether it be the radio, either it be local radio or the news, right? You watch a segment or listen to a segment, it's in and out what you needed. You get what you need from it, and that's it.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with starting off your show with somebody that's really cool or interesting, and then shifting gears into something else that your audience is also going to find interesting. I think a lot of us tend to look at, okay, I've got a podcast episode coming up for December the 4th. Who am I going to get for December the 4th? I know I'll get Jim, and Jim's going to come on and talk about paranormal, and that's the whole episode. Well, no, maybe Jim only needs to be the first 10 minutes, and then I got something else for the rest of the show.
Absolutely. No, very good.
I was just saying that's a perfect amount of Jim.
Yep. Absolutely. Can't disagree with that. Okay, Greg, you want to take us home here, old friend?
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. Thanks for everybody for listening and coming to Podcasting Power Hour. As always, you can listen to this episode in a replay format on podcastingpowerhour.com. Yes, the Twitter space turns into a podcast. It happens with magic. It doesn't take any work at all. It edits itself. AI writes the copy. There are no humans involved in this. It just happens.
And somehow Ed, he's not in here right now, but the 80s movie podcast guy, Ed Havens, all his stuff gets cut out automatically. We don't really know how that happens.
No, it's the AI. I just told the AI, make the show good. And it basically kept all the silences and the ums and everything, just cuts out Ed.
Damn. Like that. We'll have to save this clip for him.
Exactly.
No, okay, I'll finish it up. That's podcastingpowerhour.com, and it's available on, well, hell, Greg, I'm going to say everywhere you can find a podcast. Somebody can probably prove me wrong, but
yeah, I don't put it on Spotify because that's just old crap. I mean, I don't want to. I'm lying. It's on Spotify. That's where we get all the listens.
Interesting. Well, yeah, thanks for coming in and joining us. We'll be back next Monday and every Monday.
On the Stitcher?
It's on the Stitcher. It's on the Stitcher, Jim.
Now, if you
speaking of old apps, Jesus,
you go with Jim's podcast, you might get on there 2 months after you do a live interview. Anyway, nevertheless.
Yeah. It's been a long summer, Jeff.
I listened to Jim's podcast on broadcast.fm.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Telcast.
Every Monday, 9 p.m. Eastern. Jim Mallard, shut the hell up. We're taking this one home. Every Monday, 9 p.m. Eastern, Podcasting Power Hour. Thanks for listening, and thanks for telling a friend.
Thank you for listening to the Podcasting Power Hour. Everyone is free to participate on Twitter Spaces every Monday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. To join, just follow Jeff at podcast_father or Greg at Indie Drop-In. If you found this podcast helpful, go into your podcast app and write a quick review. Other podcasters will see it and know this show is worth listening to. Also, I'll put a few links in the show notes for ways you can support the show. I think by now you know we love our coffee. Have a great week.
All right, Jim, go ahead.
People are telling their friends not to come. Where did everyone go?
I don't know. It's been it's been the smallest one ever, probably.
That's my point.
2 weeks ago or something, we had 163 people in here.
Yeah, no.
Now we have.
See what happens when you let me talk unfettered?
No, Neil was great. It was really good.
It's probably me being an asshole. It's not you, Neil.
No. I honestly didn't know that this would, that we would have enough to talk about this for an hour. So I had 2 or 3 other topics kind of penciled out, but I think it's good.
It was a good conversation.
Yeah. Interacting with guests is hard.
Yep.
And
I mean, you'd be surprised at just how many people actually get it wrong. That's the thing, between having guests and the interview process. Because to me, and I was going to say this before you guys had ended, but I mean, for me, the best at least the best interviews, quote unquote, are the ones that feel more like a conversation, because I listen to a bunch of morning radio shows. For instance, I live in New Jersey, so one of them I listen to is Preston and Steve, and when they have guests on, it's especially if they've been on the show a couple of times, it's like an old friend coming onto the show, and they kind of just catch up. Obviously, they talk about why the person's there and other things, but it just feels like a conversation between friends that haven't spoken to each other in a while.
It's an art because podcasters try this all the time, and I find myself going, "Who is this person? Why are they here? What is happening?" So it's really a skill that you have to develop because you're really having the conversation for the audience. And that's different than having a dinner conversation with a friend.
That's something that I wish more people would be conscious of too, because, not only the audience's time and not wasting their time, but also your guest also has stuff to do. So I was listening to an episode of somebody's podcast a couple weeks ago, and they go to all kinds of lengths while you can hear that the guest is there because you can hear the artifacts from Riverside that have still crept into their audio channel. And so you can still hear that they're there. And they say hi to them, and then the guest says hi back. And then they do the intro. And they start reading their bio and their credits and all this, and the book is called this, and the website's called this, and all the calls to action, blah, blah, blah. And then they go to actually say more than hi to the guest, and the guest corrects them because something in the bio was wrong. And I'm just like, okay, 1, why didn't that get edited out? 2, why did you waste the guest's time by making them sit there listening to someone read them their bio? 800 ways that could have been avoided and be done smoother. If I've got Lou Graham from Foreigner sitting in front of me in a chair, I don't need to tell Lou that he had 14 number 1 songs on the pot. Stop. Get to the good stuff.
Yeah, I agree. It's amazing to me when I hear it done well, how they get to the main points, but I don't really feel like it's scripted, right? It's easy for me to want to introduce a guest, hi, Jeff Townsend, host of Indie Podcaster, superstar of MySpace because, he'd run around with his shirt off, all this, whatever made Jeff famous originally. And then, but that's the wrong approach. And getting to that stuff in the conversation is the right approach. But man, it's so hard.
It can even just be setting it up in the intro to the show. Like the podcast I was talking about before, the sleep podcast that I used to do. Everything about the guest's bio and whatever information you needed to know in order to kind of set it up that, hey, this person's interesting and they're going to be worth listening to. I take care of that when it's just me doing the intro. Hey, in a second, we're going to get to our conversation with, Dr. Fred Smith from Yale University. He's going to be talking about this great new thing, blah, 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 blah. And then we cut to my first question for them. Now, I had a setup first question that every guest that was ever on the show, they all got the same first question. So that was kind of fun because that was an easy edit point, because then I get to cut to the point in the conversation where I went, okay, Bob, you get the same first question that everybody that's ever been on the show gets, and here it is. And we're off to the races. So I don't need to keep any of the stuff that happened before that moment and all of the setup of who the guest is and why they're there. I already took care of that before the guest was even on the show.
I do the same thing with Jack and Brad. As the producer, I will actually intro, which everybody has advised me against. And what I've done is I take the first 30 seconds, intro the show, and then I'll intro the guest, the bullet points of the guest. 5-time Grammy award-winning, 4-time Songwriter of the Year, Jeffrey Steele. 12 number one hits he's written. Because again, my goal is for when Brad or Jack walks into the studio and says hello to the guest, for them it's a conversation, right? So you sit down and they start shooting the shit, ask how the wife's doing, ask how the kids are doing, ask how music's doing. But the last thing I've told Brad and Jack is, and they don't want to, intro the guest. So I'll do that in the first 30 seconds and then I'll pitch it to Jack or Brad. Because I use the analogy of the headlining band doesn't introduce the opening band. So let me introduce, or let someone other than you to introduce the guest. So again, I'll take that 30 seconds, intro the show, quickly go through the bullet points of the guest, and then I'll quote unquote toss it to Jack or Brad, and then they'll just right into the conversation.
See, the example for the setup that I always use as far as the pacing was concerned and the way I always think about it, whether it's Johnny Carson, Jimmy Kimmel, David Letterman, all of them, they all do it exactly the same way, and they do it exactly the same way for a reason. My guest tonight has this credit, this credit, this credit, and this credit. Please welcome so-and-so. And then, after you've already been told what the credits are and what it is that's going to make them interesting, then the person comes out from behind the curtain and they come and sit down, not before. Don't have them sit there listening to their credits while they're sitting in the room with you. It's just that it's first of all, if I was the guest, I don't want to hear, ew, that's creepy to me.
Exactly. I totally agree. It's just like you're bragging about them in front of them.
You can do that for me when I'm on the show. I want to hear it.
Add a voice for everybody, right?
That's right. I want to hear the back smacking. Wait, no, don't put that in.
Yeah.
Tell me more about me.
Exactly. Ooh, I have done all that great stuff. Yes.
Nobody makes me bleed my own blood.
Greg Townsend, the creator of
one last thing. I'm sorry to bust in here, but what I'll do is and this has been I've been racking my brain about this for years. I'll intro the guest. I'll intro the show, intro the guest in the first 30 to 45 seconds. Tag the sponsor. Then I'll toss it into a 1-minute preview. So I'll take the hour-and-a-half conversation, and I'll take, obviously little snippets. I'll put it into a 1-minute preview, and then I'll go into the episode. Because I want to give the listener an idea of what's coming up. So I'll take the first 30, 45 seconds, intro the show, intro the guest, toss it to a 1-minute preview, coming up, and this do a 1-minute preview, and then it'll go right into the episode. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but that's the way I've done it. If anybody have any suggestions, do it otherwise. I'm always racking my brains about how I can do it better.
I don't think there is a right or wrong. I don't
Yeah.
think there's a right way or a wrong way to do it. I think it's like, when we were having sort of the genesis of this conversation on Twitter this afternoon, it's like, you know what, everybody can do it whatever way they want to do it. The moment that it's time to change is when somebody complains about it. Because I don't know that the way you set up your interview is going to either attract or cost listeners unless it becomes sort of onerous and boring. But if you're doing an intro that's only 30 seconds long and it's telling me about who the guest is and why they're on the show, okay, well, the guest and why they're on the show is half of why I'm there. Sure, I'm there for Jack, but I'm also there to hear the guest. So I don't mind listening to you spend 30 seconds setting them up. I don't think that's a big deal. I don't think there is a right.
That's just funny. I try to get in and out as quick as I can because I don't want anybody to say, God, that dude will never shut the hell up. So I get in and out as quick as I can, pitch it to the 1 minute preview, and then it goes straight into the episode.
You know what's funny about that, Neil, is you're right about, they're there for Jack, but they're also there for the guest. When I listen to Joe Rogan, it's specific guest episodes, and that's it. Like, I don't listen to every single episode just because I'm not into all those people, right? Like, I don't care about MMA. I don't, whoever all he talks to, I just don't care about. But like when he had Zuckerberg on, or like when he has Musk on, or when he has like space scientist weirdos on, like that is super cool. And
so how do you know, and here's how do you know what guest, if Rogan releases an episode tomorrow,
and
his name is John Smith, how do you know what I'm asking this for a selfish reason. How do you know what John Smith is? How do you know who John Smith is? It says
it in the description. And also Rogan puts his MMA stuff, like he tags them MMA, so I know to avoid them.
Okay, got it. Cool.
So
that's what
if I were interviewing people for 100% of the job and I had niches, like I said, even Rogan has a niche. He interviews MMA people. I would absolutely highlight that niche in the title. And then, I would put indicators in the title of the type of shows they are. So like if it's like a musician or, whatever, like I would find a way to stick it in the title, because podcast apps are funny and you might not see everything in every app.
Gotcha. Since there's 8 people here, I'm going to ask this question because I feel like I have the balls to ask. So Rogan's studio is within like 5 minutes of Jack's studio house. And Ingram's real close to McConaughey, and Rogan's had McConaughey on the show. How does that all work with his show, with that show? Y'all have a ton more experience than I do in this world. But when it comes to the Rogan world, how does that work with guests and these random guests that he has? Does he have producers that are actively looking for folks, or is it just whoever he wants his producers to call for that day to come in the following week?
From what I understand, and I've only heard this, and I don't have any definite information, but I follow someone that was very heavily interested, or Rogan was very heavily interested in him going on the show. But I think the way it works for his podcast in particular is that you have to be invited. You basically have to be invited to even get on the show. And I guess depending on if the team reaches out to them or not, I guess like you said, it depends, but it's definitely like a very exclusive invite that you have to get for that sort of deal, because otherwise people I know of probably would have been interviewed already by him.
It's kind of like to be a member at Augusta National, the Masters, you don't get invited. And if you have to ask to be invited, you're probably never going to be invited. They come to you and invite you to be a member. Sounds like the same world.
You should see if you can shoot a DM over to Adam Curry and ask him. He might be able to tell you. He might even be able to give you a referral, because he's been on Rogan, I don't know, 2 or 3 times.
Adam Curry.
Yeah, he's the pod father.
Okay, cool. Yeah, awesome. That's fantastic. Yeah, because Jack's not going to ask. He's just not going to. But he's a one phone call away from him, and I respect that with Jack. I mean, he doesn't like to ask because he just doesn't like to.
You gotta think about it though. Like it's the same thing we were just talking about. Like you have to have something to kind of bring to the table. And I think Rogan has Curry on. Like if you ever listen to those shows, which I would highly recommend listening to Adam Curry's Rogan interviews, because he talks about podcasting in the industry, and I think that that's just something that Rogan likes to stay caught up on. But I don't know. I don't have any idea how it works. I imagine it's referrals and producers doing the work and picking out guests that will play to Joe's audience and people he is interested in talking to. Because it sounds to me like most of these folks is just Joe's ego getting stroked, right? Like it's everybody he wants to talk to.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like I bet you his producers like, who does Rogan want to talk to? I mean, it could be the homeless guy on the street. If Rogan enjoys it, great guest for him. Because it's not like he's looking for new listeners, per se. But that's just my 2 cents.
Can I talk about this Joe Rogan thing for a second? How long is his deal with Spotify?
I thought it was another 2 years. I think it's only one down, 2 to go.
Wasn't it 5 years? I thought it was 5.
No, I honestly don't know. I'm just going by my memory, but now that you're questioning it, I'm backing off completely.
No, like I could have sworn it was like somewhere upwards of like 3 to 5 years. I just don't know the exact numbers.
I think it's still kind of not officially disclosed, but it's all rumored. Like the deal was like $200 million, not $100 million. It was like 5 years.
Is he really even benefiting from it at all though? Like I know he's got the money, but like is his show like actually benefiting from like the exclusivity of it all? Is there anything to prove that?
I don't think Spotify. My guess is I think that if they could do it over again, they probably wouldn't have. But that's just a complete ignorant guess.
I mean, considering that workers within the company have been trying to cancel the fucking guy, and even though didn't they try to?
Oh yeah, all the
didn't
time.
didn't they delete a certain amount of episodes because of whatever reasons?
Yeah, but I mean, at the end of the day, it's still a top 3 podcast every single day.
You're right.
So,
on that, Jeff.
So Forbes, it's through 2023. So he's got a year and change left. And Forbes reports that contrary to what the New York Times initially reported, they say it was in upwards of 200 million, not 100 million like the New York Times. Like it's the very first paragraph, because like contrary to what the New York Times reported, Spotify paid Joe Rogan at least $200 million.
And I would heard the $1 million question is the $200 million question is they know now if they're going to renew or not. I mean, they're obviously going to keep it under, but at this point in the game, you're either actively negotiating to extend your deal, or you're actively saying, I don't want to renew it. And he'll do his own thing.
I mean, but then again, like I just said, he's still one of the most listened to podcasts every single day.
Yep.
And so it hasn't changed. Yep. No matter what he said, nothing's changed. No matter what stories have come out, that hasn't changed. Imagine how much money a TV network would pay for a show that they know is going to be a most top 3 watched television show. It would be way beyond anything we're talking about now.
Yeah, I would bet that if Netflix or YouTube, wanted to make it exclusive, he's going to get triple that or more.
I can see YouTube doing it because, as far as I know, I don't know if his episodes are still being posted to YouTube. And I know a whole draw of him is like the video portion of his podcast, because you actually see like everything going on in the studio. You see the guests he's talking to. Like, I would say his show is probably one of the blueprints for how to do a video podcast properly.
If it wasn't for Joe Rogan, I wouldn't be doing this today, because that's how I've gotten to listening to podcasts, and that's how I came up with at least the studio look for Jack and Brad both. I mean, that's
he's been grinding it out for a long time, man. It's not like he's new.
Oh God, you should see the episodes 10 years ago. I don't know if you've ever pulled up the episodes from like 2010. It's like a webcam.
Yep.
It's funny.
Yeah, but that wasn't my intention to turn the conversation to Joe Rogan. But as far as interviews go, I don't know how he does it. I mean, every time I listen to him, I just think either he's prepped extensively or he just that good at it. I don't know. I mean, he falls over sometimes, but just not very often.
I feel like once he gets like stupid high, as he's typically known to do, it kind of just devolves. And I don't really necessarily know if I mean that in a negative connotation. It kind of just devolves into like a casual BSing conversation. Like, hey, did you see? Like, what was the one thing? The epic clip of him like talking. I don't know if it was Elon Musk or they were talking about like some sort of philosophical subject, and all of a sudden it's like, did you hear about the guy that got run over by a moose or something? It was something along those lines.
I got to jump off here, guys.
Yeah, me too. I got to bring in my plants. It's going to frost tonight.
Yep. It's going to snow
Thanks,
here.
you guys. Thanks for doing this.
I know. It was a fun time. All right.
Everybody.
See you, team.
Take care, guys.
All right. Bye-bye.